Behind the completely absurd premise of facial transplants and identity swaps lies an even weirder production story that's almost too bizarre to believe. From Johnny Depp rejecting the role because he thought it was about hockey to Nicolas Cage being terrified of his own animatronic double, this John Woo action spectacle was born from a string of Hollywood mishaps and studio panic. Here are 15 weird facts you didn't know about Face Off 1997. Fact 1. Johnny Depp rejected the role because he thought it was about hockey. When Johnny Depp's name first came up for Face Off in the mid-1990s, he seemed like a perfect fit for what would eventually become one of Hollywood's most bizarre action thrillers. The young actor was riding high on his success from What's Eating Gilbert Grape and Ed Wood, and Paramount Pictures was eager to turn the 27-year-old into their next major action star. The studio executives were so determined to land Depp that they told Nicolas Cage, who had already expressed serious interest in the project, that they would only consider him if Depp agreed to star as his co-lead. But there was just one problem with this carefully orchestrated casting plan. When Depp finally received the script and took the time to read through it, he discovered something that completely killed his enthusiasm for the project. According to screenwriter Michael Colleary, who later revealed this almost too strange to believe story, Depp had made a critical assumption about the movie based purely on its title. The actor had convinced himself that Face Off would be a hockey film, and he was genuinely excited about the prospect of starring in a sports drama. You can imagine Depp's disappointment when he worked his way through the script, only to find absolutely no ice rinks, hockey sticks, or Stanley Cup dreams anywhere in the story. Instead, he discovered a wild science fiction action thriller involving facial transplant surgery, terrorist plots, and John Woo's signature gun-blazing action sequences. Colleary explained that after finishing the script, Depp simply refused to take part in the production. The actor was apparently so let down by the lack of hockey content that he immediately walked away from what would have been a major blockbuster opportunity. This casting mishap actually proved the screenwriter's point about their title choice. When Paramount had earlier tried to convince them to remove the slash from Face Off, worried that it would confuse audiences, Colleary and his writing partner had argued that people might mistake it for a hockey movie without the punctuation. Depp's reaction provided the perfect real-world example of exactly why that slash was so important to keep in the title. Fact 2. The title's slash nearly caused a studio war. A single piece of punctuation almost derailed one of the 1990s most memorable action films before it ever reached theaters. Paramount Pictures executives were deeply concerned about the slash in Face Off, believing that the unusual punctuation mark would create serious problems for the movie's marketing and distribution. The studio's worries centered around practical concerns about how the title would appear on movie theater marquees, where space limitations and technical constraints could make the slash difficult to display properly. During what screenwriter Michael Colleary described as a massive studio meeting filled with executives and department heads, the writers found themselves in the unusual position of having to defend a single punctuation mark. The studio representatives argued that the slash would confuse moviegoers and create unnecessary complications for theater owners who needed to display the title clearly on their marquees. They pushed hard for the writers to simply call the movie Face Off, eliminating what they saw as an unnecessary and problematic piece of punctuation. But Colleary and his writing partner Mike Werb had a compelling counter-argument that ultimately saved their preferred title. They explained to the room full of executives that removing the slash would create an even bigger problem than keeping it. Without that crucial punctuation mark, they argued, audiences would likely assume the movie was about ice hockey, rather than an action thriller involving facial transplant surgery and identity swapping. The writers pointed out that Face Off was already the title of a well-known hockey term, and there had even been a hockey movie released in Canada back in 1971 with that exact title. The screenwriter's prediction about audience confusion turned out to be remarkably accurate. Their argument gained even more weight when Johnny Depp later rejected the lead role specifically because he had assumed from the title that the film would be about hockey. This real-world example of exactly the kind of confusion the writers had warned about helped prove their point about why the slash was so essential to the title's clarity and the film's marketing success. Fact 3. John Woo paid for a scene out of his own pocket. Director John Woo was so passionate about including one particular scene in Face Off that he literally paid for it with his own money when the studio refused to fund it. The scene in question features Adam, the young son of terrorist Castor Troy, sitting peacefully and listening to Over the Rainbow on his portable headphones while chaos and violence unfold around him. This moment of innocent tranquility amid the film's intense action sequences wasn't part of the original screenplay that screenwriters Mike Werb and Michael Collery had written, but Woo felt it was essential to the emotional impact he wanted to create. The scene held special significance for Woo because it connected to his previous work and his distinctive filmmaking style. He had included a very similar moment in his 1992 Hong Kong film Hard Boiled, where a character listens to music on headphones during a violent confrontation. For Woo, these quiet musical interludes served as powerful contrasts to the explosive action happening around them, creating a deeper emotional resonance that went beyond typical action movie spectacle. When Woo proposed adding this scene to Face Off, Paramount Pictures executives balked at the additional cost and refused to approve the budget for what they saw as an unnecessary addition to an already expensive production. The studio was already spending $80 million on the film and didn't want to invest more money in a scene that wasn't in the original script they had approved. Rather than abandon his vision or argue endlessly with studio executives, Woo made the remarkable decision to finance the scene himself, using his own personal funds to hire the crew and equipment needed to shoot the sequence. The director's financial gamble paid off when Face Off became a major box office success, earning over $245 million worldwide. True to their word, Paramount Pictures reimbursed Woo for the money he had spent on the. This incident perfectly illustrates Woo's dedication to his artistic vision and his willingness to put his own money where his creative instincts led him. Fact 4. The prison's name is Nowhere, spelled backwards. The high-security prison featured in Face Off carries one of the most cleverly hidden wordplay jokes in action movie history, though most viewers never notice it during their first viewing. The facility where Sean Archer is imprisoned while disguised as Castor Troy is called Erawan Prison, which appears to be just another made-up name for a fictional correctional facility. However, if you spell Erawan backwards, you get Nowhere, which perfectly describes both the prison's location and the hopeless situation of the inmates trapped inside. This naming choice becomes even more meaningful when you discover the prison's actual location, which is revealed during one of the film's most surprising moments. When Archer attempts to escape from Erawan, he opens what he believes is a door leading to a rooftop where he might find freedom. Instead, he discovers that the door opens onto a helicopter landing platform, and when he looks down, he sees nothing but ocean stretching endlessly in every direction. The prison isn't built on land at all, but rather on a converted oil rig sitting in the middle of the sea, making it literally a place that exists nowhere in relation to normal civilization. The filmmakers added other subtle wordplay elements throughout the prison sequences that reinforce this theme of isolation and impossibility. During Archer's time in Erawan, he encounters storage boxes labeled with the word Ingen, which means no one in Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish languages. These details work together to create a sense that the prison exists outside normal reality, a place where identities disappear and prisoners become nobody trapped nowhere. The prison's unique setting on an abandoned oil rig also serves the story's practical needs, explaining why escape seems impossible and why the facility can operate with such extreme security measures. The magnetic boots that all prisoners must wear make perfect sense in this environment, as they prevent inmates from moving freely around the metal platform structure. The ocean location also explains why the prison guards can use such harsh methods without outside oversight, since Erawan truly exists in a legal and physical nowhere that regular authorities cannot easily reach or monitor. Fact 5. Animatronic dummies terrified Nicolas Cage. The face transplant surgery sequences in Face Off required some of the most sophisticated special effects work of 1997, but the technology that made them possible also created an unexpectedly disturbing experience for the film's lead actors. Makeup effects artist Kevin Yeager created incredibly detailed latex dummies that were designed to look exactly like Nicolas Cage and John Travolta, complete with animatronic features that could simulate the subtle movements of living human beings. These artificial doubles were so realistic that they could breathe, twitch, and make small facial movements that made them appear almost alive on the operating tables. The level of detail in these dummies was extraordinary, recreating every line, pore, and facial feature of both actors with painstaking accuracy. Yeager and his team spent months perfecting the latex skin texture and the internal mechanisms that would allow the dummies to move convincingly during the surgical scenes. The animatronic systems were sophisticated enough to create the illusion of unconscious breathing and the kind of involuntary muscle movements that would be expected from patients under anesthesia during major surgery. When Nicolas Cage first encountered his artificial double on the set, his reaction was far from what the filmmakers had expected. Instead of being impressed by the technical achievement, Cage found the experience genuinely unsettling. He later described his latex look-alike as terrifying to look at, explaining that the uncanny resemblance made him deeply uncomfortable. The dummy was so lifelike that it triggered what psychologists call the uncanny valley effect, where something appears almost human but not quite human enough, creating an instinctive feeling of revulsion or fear. This wasn't even the most frightening moment Cage experienced during the production, according to behind-the-scenes accounts, but it certainly ranked high on his list of disturbing encounters while making the film. The animatronic dummies were essential for creating the movie's most memorable and grotesque scenes, allowing John Woo to show the actual surgical procedure without requiring his lead actors to lie motionless for hours during filming. The technology was advanced enough that audiences could watch the face removal process in graphic detail without realizing they were looking at artificial constructions rather than the real actors. Fact 6. A stuntman nearly died during the boat chase. The climactic speedboat chase sequence in Face Off came dangerously close to becoming a real-life tragedy when one of the stunt performers was nearly killed during filming at San Pedro Harbor in Los Angeles. John Woo insisted on using practical effects for the boat chase rather than relying on computer-generated imagery, which meant that real speedboats were racing through the harbor at high speeds, while stuntmen performed dangerous maneuvers on and around the moving vessels. This commitment to authentic action created spectacular footage, but also put the stunt team in genuinely perilous situations. During one particularly complex sequence, a stuntman ended up in the water between the racing boats, which continued moving at dangerous speeds around him. As the boats maneuvered through their choreographed chase, one of the vessels came terrifyingly close to running over the swimmer, who was supposed to be safely clear of the action. The boat's hull made contact with the stuntman's leg, delivering a crushing blow that could easily have been fatal if it had struck him in a different location or with more force. The impact was severe enough that the injured stuntman's leg began swelling immediately and continued to expand rapidly as shock and trauma set in. The swelling became so extreme that his pants, which had fit normally at the beginning of the day, became impossibly tight around his injured limb. The medical team and crew members on site realized they couldn't remove his pants through normal means because the fabric was cutting off circulation to his already damaged leg. They had to carefully cut the clothing away from his body to prevent further injury and allow proper medical treatment. This near-fatal accident highlights the genuine risks that stunt performers faced during the production of Face Off, especially during the water-based action sequences. The speedboat chase was filmed using what the crew called a blind driver system, where a hidden operator steered the boats from inside while the visible performers battled on deck. Despite these safety measures, the high-speed nature of the stunts and the unpredictable environment of filming on water created situations where even experienced professionals could find themselves in life-threatening danger. Fact 7. The original script was set in a futuristic world. The face-off that audiences saw in theaters was dramatically different from what screenwriters Mike Werb and Michael Collieri originally envisioned when they first conceived the story. Their initial draft was set in a distant future, complete with flying cars, advanced technology, and a world where facial transplant surgery would seem not just possible but routine. The writers felt they needed this futuristic setting to make the central premise believable, since the idea of perfectly swapping faces between two completely different people seemed too far-fetched for contemporary 1990s audiences to accept. In this original version, the story took place in a world that was decades or even centuries ahead of current technology, where medical science had advanced to the point that complete facial reconstruction could be performed with seamless results. The futuristic elements extended beyond just the medical procedures to include elaborate chase sequences featuring flying vehicles and high-tech prison facilities that made extensive use of science fiction concepts. The writers believed that this advanced setting would help audiences suspend their disbelief about the more outrageous elements of the plot. When John Woo came aboard as director, he made the surprising decision to completely abandon the futuristic elements and bring the story into the present day. Woo later explained that he simply didn't feel confident about his ability to create a convincing science fiction movie, since his expertise lay in contemporary action films rather than futuristic storytelling. He was more interested in exploring the psychological and emotional aspects of the identity swap, rather than focusing on the technological elements that would make it possible. This shift in approach meant that the writers had to completely rework their script to function in a modern setting, essentially creating what they described as a story set 5 minutes into the future, rather than decades ahead. Instead of relying on advanced technology to justify the face swap, the film would simply present it as cutting-edge experimental surgery and trust that audiences would go along with the premise. The change allowed Woo to concentrate on the human drama and the moral complexities of the situation, creating a more grounded emotional foundation beneath all the spectacular action sequences. Fact 8. Schwarzenegger and Stallone were the first casting choices. When screenwriters Mike Werb and Michael Collieri first put pen to paper to create Face Off, they had two very specific actors in mind for the lead roles of Sean Archer and Castor Troy. Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone, the two biggest action stars of the 1980s and early 90s, were the writers' dream casting for what they envisioned as an epic battle between larger-than-life characters. The choice made perfect sense at the time, since both actors were known for their massive physical presence and their ability to carry blockbuster action films that relied more on spectacle than subtle character development. The writers specifically crafted the characters to take advantage of what they described as Schwarzenegger and Stallone's oversized on-screen personas. These two actors had spent their careers playing characters who were essentially superhuman in their physical capabilities and moral certainty, making them perfect for a story that required audiences to believe in an absolutely outrageous premise. The idea of these two muscular giants literally swapping faces and trying to fool everyone around them into believing they were someone else had a kind of absurd logic that seemed to fit their established screen images. This original casting concept would have created a very different movie from the psychological thriller that Face Off eventually became. With Schwarzenegger and Stallone in the lead roles, the film would likely have focused more on physical action and less on the subtle acting challenges that made the final version so compelling. The two actors were famous rivals in Hollywood during this period, competing for the same action movie roles and box office dominance, so putting them together in a movie where they literally became each other would have been a marketing dream. However, when John Woo came aboard as director, he had different ideas about the kind of story he wanted to tell. Woo felt that John Travolta and Nicolas Cage would be much better suited to handle the complex emotional and psychological elements that he wanted to emphasize in his version of the script. The casting change completely transformed the nature of the project from a straightforward action spectacle into a more nuanced exploration of identity and performance. Fact 9. The actors learned to mimic each other by watching. Nicolas Cage and John Travolta faced one of the most unusual acting challenges in Hollywood history when they signed on for Face Off, since they would spend most of the movie playing each other rather than their own characters. To prepare for this complex performance requirement, the two actors dedicated 2 full weeks before filming began to an intensive study session where they carefully observed and analyzed each other's every movement, gesture, and vocal pattern. This preparation period was essential because the success of the entire film depended on audiences believing that each actor could convincingly portray the other's character after the surgical face swap. During these preparation sessions, Cage and Travolta worked together to identify the specific physical and vocal characteristics that defined each of their characters. They paid close attention to details like hand gestures, walking patterns, the way each character held his head, and subtle vocal inflections that would help distinguish Sean Archer from Castor Troy. The actors also decided on particular mannerisms and speech patterns that could be mimicked effectively, creating a kind of performance vocabulary that both of them could learn and reproduce convincingly. The method they used was surprisingly straightforward, but required intense concentration and attention to detail. Rather than relying on complex acting techniques or elaborate coaching, they simply watched each other act and practiced copying what they observed. This approach allowed them to develop an understanding of each other's natural performing style, while also creating the specific character traits that would make the identity swap believable on screen. The 2 weeks of preparation proved crucial for the film's success, since both actors needed to be able to switch between playing their original characters and playing each other's characters throughout the production. Travolta had to master Cage's distinctive speaking style and physical presence when playing Castor Troy in Sean Archer's body, while Cage had to capture Travolta's more measured and controlled approach when playing Sean Archer in Castor Troy's body. This careful preparation allowed them to create performances that were convincing enough to make audiences forget they were watching actors pretending to be other actors. Fact 10. John Woo crashed a real plane into a hangar. One of the most spectacular moments in Face Off involved a genuine aircraft collision that John Woo orchestrated with military precision and no possibility for a second take. The opening sequence where Castor Troy's plane crashes into the airport hangar wasn't created using miniatures, computer graphics, or movie magic, but rather featured an actual airplane smashing into a real hangar structure at full speed. This commitment to practical effects was typical of Woo's filmmaking philosophy, but it also meant that the entire production had exactly one chance to capture the footage they needed for this crucial scene. Understanding the irreversible nature of this stunt, Woo deployed 13 different cameras positioned at strategic angles around the crash site to ensure that every possible perspective of the collision would be recorded. The director knew that once the plane hit the hangar, there would be no opportunity to reshoot the scene or capture additional angles, so he had to plan meticulously to make sure his camera crew could document the crash from every conceivable viewpoint. This extensive camera setup allowed the editing team to choose the most dramatic and effective shots from multiple options during post-production. The decision to use a real plane crash rather than special effects reflected both the state of technology in 1997 and Woo's personal preference for authentic action sequences. Computer-generated imagery was not nearly as sophisticated as it would become in later years, and Woo felt that practical effects would create a more convincing and visceral impact for audiences. The director was also known for his commitment to elaborate action sequences that pushed the boundaries of what was possible to film safely. The plane crash sequence required extensive safety planning and coordination with aviation authorities to ensure that no one would be injured during the filming. The hangar had to be specially prepared for the impact, and the surrounding area had to be cleared of all non-essential personnel. Despite these precautions, the crash created genuine danger for the camera operators and crew members who had to be positioned close enough to the action to capture the dramatic footage that Woo needed for his film. Fact 11. The magnetic prison boots had working LEDs. The futuristic magnetic boots, worn by prisoners in Erewhon Prison, weren't just movie props designed to look impressive on camera, but rather fully functional pieces of equipment that created genuine challenges for the actors. who had to wear them during filming. These boots were constructed from solid aluminum and metal components, making them extremely heavy and difficult to walk in for extended periods. The prop department didn't take any shortcuts when creating these specialized pieces of footwear, since John Woo wanted them to look and feel like real high-tech security devices that could actually exist in a maximum security prison facility. Each boot was equipped with working LED lights mounted on the back that would illuminate when connected to power sources, creating the visual effect that the prison's security system was actively monitoring every prisoner's movements. The lights were connected to long black wires that ran from the boots to 9-volt batteries, allowing the LEDs to function throughout filming and creating authentic glowing effects that audiences can actually see in the finished movie. This attention to detail meant that the actors didn't have to pretend the lights were working, since they could see the actual illumination during their performances. The boots were also covered with rivets, bolts, and piston-like devices that added to their industrial appearance, but also contributed significantly to their overall weight. Many of the boots featured raised prisoner identification numbers that had been individually crafted for different characters, adding another layer of authenticity to the prison setting. Some of the decorative elements, including certain bolts and attachments, were simply glued onto the boots rather than being permanently attached. And during the intense action sequences, some of these pieces would occasionally fall off and reveal their temporary nature. The weight and bulk of these functional boots created real physical challenges for Nicolas Cage and the other actors who had to wear them during the prison sequences. Walking normally was difficult enough, but performing fight scenes and action sequences while wearing such heavy footwear required considerable effort and stamina. The boots were so cumbersome that they affected the actors' natural movement patterns, which actually helped create the impression that the prisoners were being restricted and controlled by their unusual footwear. Fact 12. The test audience hated the original ending. Face Off underwent a dramatic and expensive ending change after test audiences made it clear that they absolutely despised the original conclusion that director John Woo had filmed. The initial version of the movie ended on a much more ambiguous and unsettling note that left viewers confused and unsatisfied about the fate of several key characters, particularly Adam, the young son of terrorist Castor Troy. Instead of the heartwarming adoption scene that appears in the theatrical release, the original ending featured Sean Archer looking into a bathroom mirror while his wife Eve watched from behind him, creating an unsettling moment of uncertainty about his true identity. In this alternate conclusion, Eve would see what appeared to be Troy's face looking back at her in the mirror's reflection, even though Archer had supposedly been restored to his original appearance. The scene would then cut back to show Archer's actual face before he embraced his wife. But just as the audience began to feel relieved, he would begin to smile with the same menacing expression that Troy had used throughout the film. This ending was designed to leave viewers questioning whether the face swap had been completely successful, or if some part of Troy's personality had remained with Archer. When Paramount Pictures screened this version for test audiences, the reaction was overwhelmingly negative. Viewers were left feeling confused about what had actually happened to the characters and frustrated that the film didn't provide clear resolution to the story's central conflicts. Many audience members specifically wanted to know what would happen to Adam, Troy's innocent son who had been caught in the middle of the violence between his father and Archer. The ambiguous ending provided no answers about the child's future or whether Archer would take responsibility for him. Realizing that their artistic vision had failed to connect with audiences, Paramount made the expensive decision to bring back John Travolta, Joan Allen, and Dominique Swain for additional filming. The studio spent considerable money to reshoot the ending with the adoption scene that appears in the final version, where Archer and his family welcome Adam into their home. Ironically, this heartwarming conclusion was actually closer to what screenwriters Mike Werb and Michael Colleary had originally envisioned for their story, before Woo's more ambiguous approach was attempted. Fact 13. Nicolas Cage's character makes fun of Travolta's ridiculous chin. One of the most awkward moments during Face Off's production occurred when John Travolta discovered that Nicolas Cage's character would be insulting his physical appearance on screen, leading to an uncomfortable conversation between the actor and the film's writers. In the script, Castor Troy makes several disparaging comments about Sean Archer's facial features after waking up in Archer's body, including a particularly pointed reference to what he calls Archer's ridiculous chin. When Travolta read this line, he was understandably concerned that the writers might be making personal jokes at his expense, since Cage would be delivering the insult while wearing Travolta's face. Travolta approached screenwriters Mike Werb and Michael Colleary directly to ask whether they were deliberately mocking his appearance through the dialogue they had written for the character. The actor wanted to understand if the ridiculous chin comment was intended as a meta-joke about his own facial features, or if there was some other explanation for why the script included such specific physical criticisms. This conversation put the writers in the delicate position of having to reassure their lead actor that they weren't trying to insult him personally while also explaining the character motivations behind the dialogue. The writers explained to Travolta that the insulting comments weren't meant to reflect their own opinions about his appearance, but rather served to illustrate Castor Troy's extreme narcissism and self-obsession. They told him that Troy was written as such an egomaniacal character that he would naturally hate being trapped in anyone else's body, regardless of how that person actually looked. The terrorist's complaints about Archer's physical features were meant to show how much Troy loved his own appearance and how disturbing he would find it to be stuck with someone else's face and body. This character trait was essential to the story because it helped explain why Troy would be so desperate to get his own face back and why he would feel genuine revulsion at having to inhabit Archer's body. The writers added multiple lines where Troy criticizes various aspects of Archer's appearance, not because they wanted to mock Travolta, but because they needed to show how a completely self-centered character would react to being forced into someone else's physical form. Fact 14. John Woo surprised Cage with birthday cake mid-scene. Director John Woo's attempt to celebrate Nicolas Cage's birthday during the filming of Face Off created one of the most awkward moments on set and taught the director an important lesson about timing when it comes to mixing personal celebrations with intense, dramatic performances. The production schedule happened to fall on Cage's birthday, and Woo decided that he wanted to do something special to acknowledge the occasion and show his appreciation for his lead actor's dedication to the challenging role. However, the director's timing for this surprise celebration could not have been worse given what was happening with the scene they were filming that day. Woo had been working with Cage to build up the emotional intensity needed for a particularly dramatic and emotionally charged scene that required the actor to tap into deep feelings of anger, frustration, or pain. The director encouraged Cage to get himself into the right psychological state for the performance, allowing him to build up the internal energy and emotional preparation that would make the scene convincing and powerful. Cage spent time getting himself mentally prepared for what was clearly going to be a demanding and emotionally draining sequence that would require him to access some difficult feelings. Just as Cage had reached the peak of his emotional preparation and was ready to deliver what would likely have been an intense and compelling performance, Woo chose that exact moment to spring his birthday surprise. The director had arranged for the crew to bring out a birthday cake and presumably expected this gesture to create a happy and celebratory moment that would lift everyone's spirits on set. Instead, the sudden shift from dramatic intensity to birthday party atmosphere created a jarring interruption that completely destroyed the emotional momentum that Cage had been carefully building. The timing of this surprise was so disruptive to Cage's acting process that he felt compelled to speak directly to Woo about it afterward. Rather than simply accepting the well-intentioned gesture and moving on, Cage specifically asked the director never to do anything like that again during filming. This request suggests that the birthday surprise had genuinely interfered with Cage's ability to maintain the emotional state he needed for his performance, creating a professional problem rather than the positive moment that Woo had intended. Fact 15. The film was inspired by a friend's hang-gliding accident. The central concept that made Face Off possible came from a tragic, real-life accident that happened to someone close to screenwriters Mike Werb and Michael Colleary, proving that sometimes the most outlandish movie ideas have their roots in actual events. A mutual friend of both writers suffered a severe hang-gliding accident that resulted in catastrophic facial injuries requiring extensive reconstructive surgery. The medical procedures that followed this accident involved techniques that the writers had never heard of before, including the complete surgical removal of the injured person's face so that doctors could rebuild the underlying bone structure and tissue. During the lengthy recovery process, the writers learned about the complex surgical procedures that their friend was undergoing, which involved doctors essentially taking apart the damaged face and then carefully reconstructing it piece by piece before reattaching it to the person's head. This medical process fascinated Werb and Collery not just because of its technical complexity, but because it raised intriguing questions about identity and appearance that they had never considered before. The idea that a person's face could be completely removed and then put back on seemed like something from science fiction, yet it was happening to someone they knew personally. The writers began to wonder what would happen if this kind of facial reconstruction technology could be used for purposes other than healing accident victims. They started asking themselves hypothetical questions about whether it would be possible to take one person's face and attach it to someone else's head, and what kinds of dramatic situations might arise from such an exchange. These conversations eventually led them to develop the core premise of Face Off, where two enemies would be forced to literally wear each other's faces and live each other's lives. While the medical procedures in Face Off go far beyond what was actually possible with 1990s surgical technology, the basic concept of facial removal and reconstruction was grounded in real medical techniques that the writers had witnessed through their friend's recovery process. This connection to actual medical procedures helped them create a story that felt believable despite its outrageous premise, since they knew that at least part of what they were writing about had actually happened in real life.